All right, good afternoon, everyone. Let's begin. I'm Gabriel Metcalf, CEO of the Committee for Sydney, and we are today going to do a briefing on the New South Wales budget, um, which came out yesterday, and if you're like me, you spent last night and this morning reading everything you could in the newspapers. So yeah, some really interesting things we have to talk about. Let me start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land and pay my respects to elders past, present, and future. And then let me introduce our speakers. We have three incredibly knowledgeable people today. First of all, Stephen Walters will give the overview. Stephen is known to most of you who are members of the committee. He is the chief economist of New South Wales Treasury. Before joining Treasury, Stephen was chief economist with the Australian Institute of Company Directors and chief economist for the investment bank at JP Morgan. He was previously with Access Economics and international economist with Norwich Union and Alliance Capital in the UK. And he also spent 7 years as an economist with Treasury in Perth. After Stephen gives the overview, then we will bring in our two respondents. So first, Cherelle Murphy, senior economist with ANZ. Cherelle analyzes and forecasts the Australian economy and provides regular updates on topics that are important to ANZ's clients. She has a special interest in fiscal policy and policy issues. Cherelle also, interestingly, worked as a journalist at the AFR. So we'll bring that background of paying close attention to policy as a journalist as well. And then we'll bring in Stephen Halmarick, chief economist and head of global and economic and markets research for CBA. Stephen has been chief economist, I think, just since April of this year. Is that right? Yeah. Having been head of the global economic and markets research team prior to that. He pays attention to Australian economics, international economics, rates, fixed income, foreign exchange, credit and commodities research, probably lots of other topics as well. So we've got an amazing group here. And the way this works, feel free to submit your questions via the Q&A app on Zoom. I will sort through them. I've already received some via email. And we're looking forward to hearing all about this. Stephen, take it away.
Oh, thank you, Gabriel, and welcome everyone. So, no, I really appreciate the opportunity to talk about the New South Wales budget. So it's been unusual, clearly, with here we are in November releasing a state budget, and we'll do it again in June next year. So it's a very unusual time to be doing two budgets in the space of only 7 months, but certainly been an unusual year. I think back to this time last year when we put together the budget, we were still in the midst of a drought. It's hard to remember that New South Wales had a pretty serious drought still going this time last year. And of course, those of you based in Sydney will remember the devastating bushfires we had over the summer and the smoke haze that hung over the Sydney area, particularly last summer. But of course, that was nothing compared to what was coming. And of course, the COVID pandemic has hit New South Wales very hard. And you can see that reflected clearly right through the budget, not just in the growth metrics, which frankly, I'll stick most of my comments towards talking about the economy rather than the fiscal outlook. I'll let Cherelle and Stephen talk more about the fiscal dynamics. I'm happy to comment on them, but I thought I'd stick more to the economics, given it was myself and my team that put those together. But New South Wales was particularly exposed to those three, we call them challenges, but I think COVID clearly is much more than a challenge. It's clearly a crisis for our economy. And I think New South Wales was particularly exposed for a few reasons. And one was we have a very large tourism industry, and similarly a very large skilled migration program, and also a very lucrative education exports from our universities and our higher education system. So when the borders closed back in February, March this year, clearly the impact on the economy was very severe. And of course, then we had domestic restrictions put in place to curtail activity, which have been very effective. I think it's fair to say, and I think on most metrics, you'd argue that New South Wales has come out of at least this stage of the pandemic. I'm loath to say come out of the pandemic because we've just seen what happens in South Australia over the last coming days. But I'm happy to say that New South Wales, I think, has handled this better than most. There's clearly a lot of risks, but clearly the economy is still in recession, and you'll see that reflected in the growth numbers in the budget. So not only do we have an expectation of negative GDP growth for the year that we've just finished in June, but we're actually expecting another fall in GDP for the current fiscal year as well, which admittedly we're well into. But to get negative GSP growth for a state back to back just shows how serious this recession is. And on the metrics, remember thinking back to September when we got those June quarter national accounts, there was a huge shock value of watching the Australian economy be revealed to have contracted by 7% in the June quarter. Well, in fact, the contraction in state final demand in New South Wales was quite materially larger than that at 8.6%. And in fact, that was the largest deterioration of all states and territories. So bearing that in mind, to get a fairly mild negative contraction of GSP this year of about 0.75, I think demonstrates the extent to which the economy has rebounded. And that's been a combination of things. I think it's partly the contraction in the housing market wasn't as bad as some feared. Certainly we had some falls in house prices. We had activity curtailed via auctions being very hard to hold clearly amidst a pandemic and restrictions on activity. But since then we've had a lot of the restrictions have eased because we've had such a great, I would argue, very, very good world-class contact tracing and testing regime, very well-functioning health system. I won't criticise other jurisdictions, but I think New South Wales is being held up as having a fantastic system. And of course, once you get the economy moving again, and I think I'm in the Sydney CBD at the moment, and having just walked around outside briefly, it's hard to tell there's a pandemic on, which I think is quite remarkable that there is, clearly, and we've all seen what's going on in the Northern Hemisphere, particularly the US and Europe, and yet here we are moving around with, I would argue, a huge degree of freedom around our state, I think is quite remarkable. So unsurprisingly, we've had consumer confidence bounce back very strongly. We've had business confidence rebound. The labour market is still clearly suffering some damage, and you'll see that in the budget when you look through the metrics on the budget, that we still have unemployment rising from where it is now. And in the latest numbers, and admittedly we get some more numbers tomorrow, but the numbers we got a few weeks back showed unemployment in New South Wales at 7.2%. So that's now above the national unemployment rate. Probably has some way to go up. We're forecasting a peak unemployment rate of about 7.5%. And I'm sure the other economists would reinforce this, that the labour market tends to lag the broader economy. So even though activity has picked up, we've got the labour market still deteriorating to some extent, but around 2/3 of the jobs that were lost during the pandemic have been recovered. So that's a great, I think, emblem of how the economy has begun repairing itself. Of course, it'll take a lot of time, and there's a lot of risks. So as we've seen in the last few days in South Australia, they've been COVID-free for some months, and yet now they've got a quite significant sized cluster down in Adelaide. So we're very mindful of that, and that would, I think, be quite damaging if there were further uncontrolled outbreaks in New South Wales, particularly in Sydney. I think you'd probably get some really quite dramatic moves in confidence and people's mobility. So we know those risks are out there, and that could, of course, make us change our economic forecast, which for now do have a relatively constructive rebound in the economy, both near term and longer term. And you'll notice further out in the out years of the budget, we're forecasting growth in the economy of around 2.5% to 2.75%. Now, of course, that's being supported by unprecedentedly supportive monetary policy from our friends over at the Reserve Bank. And of course, both the Commonwealth government and the state government have provided very substantial stimulus. I'm happy to talk through that if there are questions on that later. And that's clearly providing an environment of very supportive policy that allows the economy to rebound. One thing I just wanted to mention was one of the big drags, I think, over medium-term growth in the economy, and where there's a lot of uncertainty, is on the outlook for population growth. And you'll see that described in the budget, that our assumptions around population and opening borders and vaccines closely mirror those of the Commonwealth government. So back in October, the Commonwealth released an expectation of having an effective, workable vaccine by about the middle of next year. We have the same assumption, notwithstanding there's been some probably more favourable news in recent weeks than we're expecting. So that's good. That's a risk. You can have upside risks as well as downside. And then following on from that vaccine assumption is that we should get our borders internationally at least opened sometime over the second half of next year. Of course, we can do that earlier with some countries. We're doing it already with New Zealand in terms of a travel bubble, and we may be able to do it with other countries that have pretty good COVID outcomes themselves, like Japan and Singapore and Korea and Taiwan and others. So there's opportunities there on the population front, but I just remind you that, as Governor Lowe said on Monday night, I was sitting in the audience, and Stephen, I know you were there too, that he did say whenever you have very low population growth and effectively zero population growth, you'll have lower growth in nominal GSP, and we're certainly experiencing that as well. Gabrielle, I'll finish my introductory comments just with one further comment about reform. And I'm sure avid readers of the budget papers would have seen that the Treasury yesterday announced a program of consultation around tax reform, which I think is long overdue. Clearly, we've talked about tax reform certainly for as long as I've been an economist, and yet we haven't really got a lot of traction on that. So I'll just put it out there, and happy to answer questions about it, that it's fantastic to actually have a government prosecuting such an important reform as the hoped for abolition of stamp duty and replacing it with another form of taxation that over time will be revenue neutral, but in the near term should provide a very big stimulus to the economy of around $11 billion as we go through the transition of people moving away from having to pay stamp duty onto other forms of taxation on their land. So I thought it was a very constructive, very well put together budget, but I would say that because I was involved. But I think in the circumstances, and as bad as things have been, I think that we can look forward over the next couple of years to growth back with a 2 handle in front of it, and unemployment probably falling, I think would be a remarkably good outcome. So Gabrielle, I'll stop there. I'm happy to hand back to you.
Okay, thank you, Stephen. And I'm sure during the discussion, we are going to want to take a deeper dive into the stamp duty reform, which has been, of course, a long-standing big priority for the committee. So we were quite excited to see that it actually is probably going to happen now. But we'll talk about that more later. Cherelle, why don't we bring you in now for a response? What are your thoughts?
Great, thank you, Gabrielle, and thank you, Stephen, for the introduction. So look, it's great to be here. Can I say I do love talking about state budgets. Look, there's many things in there that we did like, many things actually. I mean, the first thing, of course, is the fiscal spending. We sort of, you know, Stephen didn't actually make much about the fact that there's an enormous amount of spending out there, which is, of course, clearly designed to try and cushion the New South Wales economy from the pandemic, and I think it's really hit the spot there. According to my calculations, that adds up to about 0.8% of GDP, and that's only in the current financial year. And of course, there is continued fiscal spending after that. That's both tax cuts and new expenditure. Now, when you add that to the sort of roughly 8% of GDP spending coming from the Commonwealth, you know, we've got a really good fiscal shot into the economy, which is exactly what we need right now. So big thumbs up in the sense that it was brave and there's a lot of spending. I think the nature of the spending was also really pretty good. That $2.8 billion of temporary Payroll tax cuts is of course going to be very welcome by a lot of the businesses which need it more than ever right now. So that's direct money back into their accounts, which is exactly what we need. The tutoring for high school students I think was a really great policy. So $337 million there for high school students who've obviously had a really difficult year through the coronavirus and the fact that they haven't been able to have normal contact with school, which of course has been really tough on some students, so that's great. The $120 million on free preschool, also great policy. We know how popular that's been. To some extent, the Commonwealth government has been whacked a bit about the fact that they didn't do more on the childcare front, so it was really good to see some of that in the New South Wales budget yesterday, and I think the Victorians are about to do the same. And then, of course, there was the measures for small business to sort of give them a few dollars towards meeting government grants and charges. Again, exactly where it should be. A lot of businesses suffering through the last 9 months who really need that. And then and the out and about vouchers, really well targeted, clearly trying to get business directly into those most hit. So the recreation sector, accommodation sector, the arts sector. We know from the statistics that clearly those are the ones which have felt most of the pain. So nice to see that. And of course, you can't save your voucher, you have to spend it. So, you get around that fiscal problem that the Commonwealth again has faced through I guess, the last 6 months with some of its stimulus. So altogether that policy expenditure and tax cuts worth about $15 billion over the forward estimates, really great numbers there. We also like the fact that there was lots of money in there for infrastructure and also the fact that it was quite broad. So it wasn't one or two big projects, but actually tilted towards transport, but it was also across the education sector, the health sector, many little projects getting a bit of money to finish them off, etc. And just looking at the purchases of non-financial assets measure, which is the one that I like because I can compare it across state budgets, that's showing that expenditure there, which is essentially just capital spending, will be about $4 billion higher this financial year, and then $6.3 billion next financial year, and $6.8 billion the year after than it was at the end of last year. So that shows again the fiscal injection is really pretty strong, and it's certainly going to get quite a lot done in that infrastructure space. I'd also say that we're pretty happy with the economic forecasts. They are slightly more optimistic than our own, but to be fair, our last forecasts were finalised in August, and the economic data since August has been a little bit more optimistic. And so as we revise our numbers, I think we're more inclined to go towards where the New South Wales Treasury have their numbers rather than the other way. There was a little bit of criticism I noticed in the news and the media in the last 24 hours about the borders and vaccines assumptions, but I think they're pretty fair. We've got to give credit to the New South Wales Treasury. You've got to make some assumptions here. You can't just assume or you can't just ignore the fact that these are going to be major variables on the economic outcomes for the next few years. And I think what the Treasury have done there is very fair. And the fact that it follows the Commonwealth just makes a lot of sense as well. I did, of course, like the fact that there was a push forward on reform. And I think particularly at this point in time when the economy is going through a recession, and that is arguably quite a difficult thing to do when economies are suffering. I think, big round of applause on that one, because, clearly the agenda, which the Treasurer has been talking about for a while, has now taken a small step forward. The stamp duty proposal, of course, looks really sensible over the long term as well. A little bit more esoteric, but something that I really like that the New South Wales Treasury does is that when they do intend to sell some of their assets, as we know they intend to do with WestConnex, or the residual part of WestConnex, the residual 49% that the New South Wales government still owns, they don't actually put those sale proceeds into their budget numbers, so they don't sort of reduce their debt numbers, and so we get a really fair assessment of what the net debt numbers will be without the asset sales. And so when when and if the asset sales go ahead, and if they're successful, that is a bit of a top up to the budget rather than being a disappointment on the other side. I think, again, that's really sensible. Not all the states and territories do that. So again, well done, New South Wales Treasury, on that one. What did I not like? I thought the public sector wage caps were unnecessary. You know, clearly this is a savings option, and it's something that you know, governments, state governments in particular, have been doing for some time to try and contain their costs. But I just think at a time like this, when we're really trying to get wage growth up again, letting the public sector have a little bit more wage growth is a good thing. And actually, you know, Reserve Bank Governor Dr. Lowe said the very same thing, that you know, we really don't need any forces depressing wages at the moment. If anything, we want wages to be elevated. And just as an aside within that, it would be really nice to see a very specific measure to ensure gender equality in wages, because although I don't have the numbers for New South Wales, we know that across the public sector as a whole, there is still a gender pay gap. So that seems like a really sensible thing to me, to not only get a bit more money into the economy, but to sort of solve that, the deterrents that come from gender wage pay gaps as well. The other thing, again, that's getting a little bit of criticism, and I have to say I agree on this one, is there could have been more on the social housing. We know that Victoria has a plan to do lots there. Again, this not only has an economic payoff in terms of the physical building of houses or maintenance or renovation of social housing, but of course it has a very strong social impact. It keeps people out of poverty, it keeps crime rates down, and it generally leads to a better future for many, many people. So a bit more money there would have been nice. I said that I like the stamp duty, and I think that is a great change. I think my only disappointment is the fact that the government just didn't start, you know, just didn't put it in place. So, you know, we've got a consultative process, that's terrific, but, you know, why not just get on with it, I say. Now, in the ACT, that's exactly what's happening, and they've clearly, it's not been an easy path. There is a lot of political blowback, but I think New South Wales have been very clever in giving people the option, at least in this consultative phase, about whether or not to pay the stamp duty up front, or go to the or go to the regular annual tax regime. So very clever. I like that a lot. I just wish they had actually done it. And something else that's not new, but something that does bother me a bit about New South Wales, is the fact that they have put their AAA credit rating in legislation. You know, that was done way back in 2012, but times like this really highlight why that is a pretty silly idea. You know, you need flexibility. You need to be able to spend money, as the government has done at the moment. And I think it would just be tragic if New South Wales got a AAA credit rating a credit rating downgrade to take them away from that AAA, which I don't think, by the way, but it's not impossible. You know, you sort of get into all sorts of political problems there, which you really didn't need to have if it wasn't in the legislation. I'll stop there and pass over to Stephen Halmarick.
Okay, thanks, Cherelle. Stephen, let's bring you in.
Yes, good afternoon, everybody, and thanks for the opportunity to talk today. So I'll try to avoid repeating what Stephen and Cherelle has said, but there's a couple of things I wanted to highlight. So first is, this is a big stimulus budget, large deficits, big build up in debt, same strategy as the federal government. We definitely think that's the right strategy. And, you know, the economy nationally and here in New South Wales needs the stimulus from fiscal policy at the moment. So that was really pleasing to see. I mean, in dollar terms, you're going to have we were expecting a budget surplus around about now, right? So the budget deficit's going to be $16 billion for this year. That's the largest in the 4-year horizon. I mean, almost back to balance by, I think, 23, 24. The build-up of debt, debt goes from $19 billion last year, roughly, to a bit over $104 billion by 23, 24. So that's a big build-up of debt. But we know, and the Reserve Bank Governor has told us this many times, that the borrowing cost of that debt is going to be incredibly low. And the Reserve Bank's going to ensure that that's the case through their quantitative easing program. So it's, in our mind, definitely we're supportive of that strategy. As Cherelle mentioned there at the end, so it does bring New South Wales pretty close to the wire on the AAA credit rating. When we look through the Standard & Poor's metrics of how they measure these things, probably it goes over the line in that if Standard & Poor's are true to their process, a downgrade could happen. But what we're seeing from Standard & Poor's with lots of governments around the world at the moment, including here in Australia, is they're being much more patient than just kind of the strict reading of their own rules, because we're in a global pandemic and every country in the world is increasing debt, and the borrowing cost of that debt, as we just said, is going to be incredibly low. So it's close to the wind, but I think lots of stimulus and keeping that AAA credit rating in place. But I agree with Cherelle, kind of volunteering to remove the flexibility on that doesn't seem like a really sensible idea. So we think it'll be supportive for the economy. So, really good stimulus. I'll run through some of the programs that we like. So that's supportive for the economy. So if anything, we actually think the economic forecasts are too conservative. So late last week, we upgraded our GDP forecast for Australia quite significantly for next year. So for calendar 2020, we expect a negative growth of minus 3.3%. But for calendar 2021, we're now expecting positive growth of 4.2%. Previously, we were 2.5%. So we upgraded national GDP growth numbers quite significantly last week. And New South Wales, we think, will be leading the charge on that. As Steve said at the opening, we've done an incredibly good job in controlling the virus. I just saw that South Australia is going to go into lockdown for a week or so now, so they're jumping on that pretty quickly, which is good. But we can see confidence has returned. Income flow has actually been very strong through this recession, which is pretty unusual. But of course, we know the income's coming from the government, and people have built up a huge pool of savings that we think will be deployed as confidence returns. And that's going to support spending in the economy. So things like the out and about vouchers, I think, are going to be really successful. We were talking about around the kitchen table having dinner last night. Some of my adult children were, pretty keen to go out and spend the money. So that's a good start. The infrastructure spending, always a priority, I think. Very positive on that. Some really massive projects, the Sydney Metro West, the new airport, the Gateway project, lots of spending on hospitals as well, which I think is really to be applauded. So those big infrastructure projects are very supportive for the economy now and into the future. I think too, as Steve mentioned, we're going to have this lull in population growth, and unfortunately the COVID numbers around the world are looking worse rather than getting better, particularly in Northern Hemisphere, US, UK, Europe. So that's a real shame, but that does likely mean our borders are going to be closed for quite a while. So some people are saying, well, maybe the population's not going to be as high as we thought. Maybe we don't need to do this infrastructure spending. But I disagree with that. I think now's the exact time to really get cracking on it. While we've got this kind of pause in population growth rate, let's really get these big projects underway and moving. And I think this morning, was it Steve, the Premier turned the first sod on the Sydney Metro West, the new tunnel railway that we built out to Parramatta. That's a fantastic project. So it'd be good to see all those underway. As I mentioned, big spending on health. Clearly in the environment we're in now, that's really, really well received. Same with education. Cherelle talked about that. So again, really good focus there. I think, I agree with Cherelle. I think one of the areas where it would have been nice to see more money, more focus is the social housing program. I think that's really critical, not from an economic point of view, to get the houses built, more affordable housing, more social housing, improve the current stock, but from an equity, from a fairness, from a humanistic point of view, getting people into housing. There really should be nobody living in this state that can't have access to safe housing. So I think a bit more focus on there would have been nice to see. And perhaps also in the energy space, the renewable energies in particular, I think that will need to be a focus as well. Finally, just as everyone's talked about, the stamp duty to land tax changes. The Treasurer has been very out on the front foot, talking about the need for tax reform for a long time. very supportive of, if we go back to the Henry tax review back in 2010. So it was fantastic to see that. I think I agree with Cherelle there. Maybe they should have just done it because it looks like a really sensible strategy. The volunteer to opt in. It'll take a while, obviously, for that process changing from stamp duty to land tax to really, become a larger part of the tax base. But it was really positive to see that, and it's pretty clear to us that the housing market has moved through this recession pretty unscathed, and we can see, and the public information we see is that home loan applications are rocketing higher, particularly for owner occupiers and for first home buyers. So a little bit of a down pressure on house prices and a drop in interest rates. You can get a 4-year fixed rate mortgage now for a big figure one. Really is attracting interest into the housing market. So this reform of stamp duty, I think, is I was going to say overdue, but given the Treasurer, apart from the ACT, is really the first large state to push forward. I think hats off to him on that, and let's hope it really does get implemented and other states will follow. So I think I might end it there. Because I'd be really interested to see the questions we get, and we can go through those. Thank you.
Okay, thanks very much, all of you. And everybody, feel free to submit your questions via the Q&A app on Zoom. All right, Stephen, it's intuitive why not having to pay an upfront stamp duty is helpful if you want to become a homeowner. But why does it matter for the economy? Why do you believe that this tax reform will lead to greater economic growth?
I assume it was this Stephen, Gabrielle?
Yeah.
Oh, sorry.
Stephen. Yeah.
Sorry, Stephen Walters.
Yeah, thank you. I'll take it. But well, firstly, I think I mentioned at the outset, Gabrielle, there's actually a stimulatory element to it because we're not requiring, if you would opt into the new system, there's quite a significant fiscal impulse through the economy because that's less revenue the government collects if people opt to pay their land tax over time rather than the stamp duty up front. That's quite a boost to growth directly from people having to pay a lower rate of tax. Certainly in the early years, they wouldn't be paying stamp duty. They'd instead pay this tax over time. But I think the bigger argument is we know from numerous reports that have been done over the years, including my own economic blueprint from last year, and I think Stephen mentioned the Henry Review from 2010, and numerous other reports that have been done on the tax system in Australia. I think it's almost unanimous that stamp duty comes out as the most destructive tax in the Federation. So it does so much damage for every dollar collected that it follows if you can replace a really damaging tax with a much more efficient tax, then everybody should be better off. And one of the big inefficiencies of stamp duty is it's a real impediment not only for people getting into the housing market, as the Treasurer said numerous times yesterday, that you spend years saving to get into the housing market and then have to pay this other tens of thousands of dollars of tax as well, just requires you to save for even longer. But one of the big things that stamp duty does is we know it's an impediment for people to move around. And there are many people in our economy who are required to go and live in different places. And I'll just say, pick a teacher, for example, who might have to move to different parts of the state. There's a real disincentive for them to buy homes. So they typically either rent or they don't move around. So what you end up with is this real sort of potential misallocation of skills across the economy. And that can be really damaging. The other is we end up with real impediments to transactions, and you typically can end up with people of more advanced age, if I can put it that way, often are sitting in very large homes that have been the family home, but it's too expensive for them to downsize and buy a new home because they don't have the income to pay a very big upfront stamp duty impost. So by actually lowering that impost and making it payable over time, we're hoping you end up with a much more efficient allocation of our housing resources. So I hope that didn't sound too jargonistic, but essentially you end up with a much more efficient system, therefore stronger growth over time. And in the consultation papers, I won't bore everyone with the details, but you'll see there's estimates in there as to what the income of every person in New South Wales should go up by, because we have hopefully moved away in a very large way from a really destructive tax.
Thank you. Cherelle and Stephen Halmarick, on the subject of tax reform, is there anything else you would especially hope to see beyond the phasing out of stamp duty? Other tax reforms that could be enacted at the state level that you would hope might get a serious look next? Maybe Cherelle, we ask you first.
Sure. So I think the obvious one, and it requires more than just New South Wales, is the GST. We know that it is falling as a share of GDP, and particularly has taken a pretty big hit this year because of lower spending, particularly on taxable goods and services. Again, this one is so difficult because this essentially needs a lead from the Commonwealth as well as the states and territories all agreeing. And clearly the New South Wales Treasurer has been on the front foot again on this one, but it really does need to be reformed, because when we look at the state budgets this year, they're all so vulnerable to that tax. Probably the single biggest item that's had to, or the single biggest revenue loss across all the state budgets, has been the GST, which just shows that it's not a tax which is designed to sort of bear with the economic cycle very well. So, the obvious way to fix it is to tax more items and or to lift the rate. Politically very difficult, but we know from an economic point of view that it makes a lot of sense. We have to kind of boost that up. And arguably now is not a bad time to do it, in the same way that the New South Wales government is using its, I guess, spending a bit more in terms of allowing the stamp duty tax foregone to just push out the deficits. The Commonwealth potentially could do the same by overcompensating those who lose from a higher GST or a more broad GST with income support payments. And so, yes, it's expensive in the first instance. Eventually it neutralizes, and over the longer term you have a much more sustainable tax base. And we know that the GST is one of the better taxes, or as good as taxes could ever be. So that's the one I guess would really like to see changed.
Yeah, that's the one you would hope would get the focus next. Stephen Halmarick, how about you?
Well, I'm not surprised Cherelle went straight for the GST, because I think most economists would agree with that totally, and I certainly do. So reform of the GST along with the income tax arrangements, I think, is well overdue. So I won't repeat why I think that, because I agree with what Cherelle said. Yeah. The other one I think would be on the high top of everybody's list is payroll tax. Taxing a tax on increase in employment when we're in a recession and the unemployment rate's gone up significantly. And I know the government in this budget put through some temporary reductions in payroll tax,
years.
both in rate and the cutoff for revenue, which was really good to see. But taxing employment doesn't sound like a really sensible idea from a national perspective over the long run. So that, again, that could play into the GST income tax. So a broader rated GST with a higher rate, supplemented by reductions in income tax and payroll tax, would make a lot of sense, i.e. things that were written in tax reform strategy papers for the last couple of decades.
Yeah, so what both of those have in common is they cannot just be done by New South Wales.
Correct.
Whereas the stamp duty reform could. One of the other ones we've been excited about is, it's much smaller, but road user charging for electric vehicles, which the New South Wales government, again, could do on its own. But I suppose it will be interesting to see if the new National Cabinet is able to maybe make some progress on the federal tax reforms you guys are talking about. Let's talk about asset recycling. this was mentioned briefly. It really hasn't been written up very much, even in the newspapers that I've seen, but discussion to sell the rest of WestConnex, maybe sell the rest of the state interest in New South Wales lotteries. I'm not sure if there are other things being looked at. What is the what's the significance of that? How much more is there to do? How many more assets are there that can be sold? Yeah, maybe Stephen Walters, that's a question for you.
Gabrielle, I'll probably just stay high level on this and not talk about individual assets or those that may be sold, but I think the very principle of governments not necessarily being the owners of certain assets is a very good one. That why does the government have to own some of these assets when in fact the proceeds of selling those assets or parts of those assets can be rotated back into infrastructure investment has been happening in New South Wales for some years now. So it's a continuation of that process, and it's had mixed success elsewhere. And I noticed the federal government was incentivising states to recycle assets some years ago. So I think in general principle terms, it's hard to argue against it, frankly. You can argue against it on ideological grounds that you think certain assets should be owned by governments, but or certain revenue streams should be owned by governments. But we all know that spending on infrastructure, as I think both Cherelle and Stephen have said, not only provide a very big stimulatory impact to your economy near term and generate jobs, but they actually add to productive capacity of your economy over time. So you end up far better off than just government sitting on an asset because we happen to own it or we happen to build it. So I think the fact that we can keep the stimulus going through the economy, and with careful selection of projects and good execution, you can actually end up with a much more efficient transport system, or I think Stephen alluded to maybe some energy assets that are that need to be developed. So I think it's a real plus that the government's getting on with it. There's clearly a lot of work to do, but I think I wish there were more states doing the same thing.
Stephen, with assets that have already been privatized, where the state simply owns an annual payment, has rights to an annual revenue stream, that would be the case with the lottery. Why is it better to capitalize that and to sell out the remaining interest rather than get an annual payment?
Well, it's the same with any other asset in itself. It's less ideological, obviously. We're not owning the asset, we just own the revenue stream, but we can use the proceeds, which is a capital payment, to invest in other things. So as long as, and of course, Treasury spends an enormous amount of time doing benefit cost ratios on these sorts of things, Gabrielle, as you'd understand. So yeah. We're very carefully choosing which projects we should invest in, and we don't necessarily invest alone. We partner with the private sector, we partner with other states, we partner with the Commonwealth, and there's no shortage of investors around the world who are very, very happy to invest in assets in Australia. So it doesn't necessarily, ideologically, I think you can make certain arguments, but of course this government, as has been the case for almost a decade, has been very, very, very happy to sell productive assets where you can use those proceeds to actually improve the welfare of the citizens of the state. So the argument still holds, whether it's a revenue stream or an asset itself.
Okay.
I'd just add in there that with the New South Wales lotteries, I do wonder if that's a business that has a long-term future anyway. You know, if it's just selling scratchies and lotto tickets, you know, we know that is a product that is associated with a certain generation, and I just wonder if the next generation is quite so keen on it. So I mean, in some ways, I think
some other way to spend their money. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, we should be quiet about that till the sale happens. Yes.
Yes.
Okay, let's change gears here and talk about population growth. You all talked about the assumptions, which are really assumptions about when the borders can open to the rest of the world. Is there any reason to wonder if the population numbers will get back up to where they were, or really get back up to whatever level the federal government allows them to be at in terms of setting the limits on immigration? Or can we be confident that maybe even more than ever before, there will be plenty of people wanting to come to Australia if they're allowed to. Any views on that?
I'm happy to jump in on that one. So I think there's a couple of things you talked about there I think really important. So one is if you're currently living outside of Australia and you look at what's happening around the world, more than ever, Australia stands out as a really good place you'd want to come and live. And maybe there's a few other countries in that bucket as well, such as New Zealand. So I think there's going to be a natural, increase in desire to move to Australia from many parts of the world. Now, they can't do that at the moment because the borders are closed. We don't want them to bring the coronavirus with them. But I think that's going to be a really important input into the government's decision on how and when to open the international borders. The other thing is what we don't know yet is whether the government will just go back to just keep the cap the same. I think it was 220,000. Someone can correct me if I'm wrong on that, but
I think it's 160,000 now. It's come down.
Right, okay. Yeah. Or maybe the government, do they just go back to the cap, or do they do a make-up strategy? And for a couple of years, we can actually make it 220, 250 as a make-up strategy. So you actually get the total population back to where it would have been if not for the border being closed for 18 months or so. So we don't know that yet, but I think that's going to be a really important part of the government, deliberation on the policy. Now, the other thing that we know is population has been one of the key drivers of potential GDP for Australia, population growth. The others being participation and productivity. So we're going to have to work really hard on participation and productivity to get decent long-run potential growth, unless we get the population numbers back up again. So for those who think maybe the population growth rate should stay lower for longer, we're going to have to be willing to do significant amounts of more work on productivity and participation, such as tax reform that we just talked about, to get the economy moving. So, there's no decisions being made any of that yet, but they're key parts of the variables. And as I said, why the population growth rate is lower for forced reasons, I think this is really the time to really crack on with the infrastructure spending, housing, social housing. Like, really, let's get it all done while we've got this lull in the population growth rate. So when it comes back, we're in a better position than we were pre-COVID.
So Stephen, in terms of participation, would that be things like universal child care subsidies?
Indeed, that's a big. Sorry, Stephen, you go.
Yeah, I think the thing that's one of the aspects that Cherelle mentioned earlier, female labour force participation is going to be absolutely critical to get the total participation rate up. So things like early child minding, child care, child education, access to that really critical. Income equality really critical. Education skills. So yeah, absolutely.
Stephen Walters, what's the Jobs Plus program? We didn't talk too much about that, but will you say a few words laying out that idea?
Well, I think the Treasurer has been quite focused, Gabrielle, in saying this is a reform and respond budget. So clearly we're trying to incentivise firms to actually create jobs in New South Wales. So part of the payroll, like, it's a broad overarching name for various elements of the policy, which is really trying to create jobs in New South Wales. And of course, one way to do that is to lower the tax burden. So we've done that with as the others have mentioned about payroll tax concessions. That's very encouraging. If you can generate at least 30 new jobs in New South Wales, you're exempt from payroll tax. So that's a very good start. There's other elements around just incentivising businesses to actually, the feedback we've got from many businesses, and we talk to the business groups fairly regularly, is that the burden of regulation by state governments particularly is so onerous that it's really hard to actually start a business, bizarrely, that you would have thought governments would want to encourage businesses to actually get up and start. And as Governor Lowe again keeps saying, to innovate and invest in and hire. It's really hard because we've got so many rules and regulations, and they build up over time. like sand in the gears. So if we can actually try to pare back some of these regulatory rules, like the number of tables you can have on various footpaths around the city and silly planning rules that have just grown over the years like weeds. So there's so many elements to it, Gabrielle. I won't go into the detail, but essentially it's focusing on jobs. We just want to get jobs created in New South Wales. And when you've got a job, as we know, as Cherelle said earlier, your social outcomes are so much better. You're participating in the labour market, you're spending money, and let's be honest, you're paying tax to the state government. So we're quite happy for people to be creating jobs, creating prosperity, and building families in New South Wales because they have a demand for assets and a demand for services. So it's win-win for everybody. And so the policy itself is designed to just incentivise, and okay, there's a bit of interstate competition here, to incentivise companies to relocate or locate in New South Wales rather than elsewhere. Now, hopefully that generates some healthy competition with other states, including Victoria.
That was obviously the piece I was asking about. I didn't realize it was a name for the overall program. Do you expect other states to respond in a bit of a race with each other to cut taxes? That's certainly the dynamic in the United States.
Well, I would hope so, because I think that ends up with the federation being better off. But let's see what other states do. There's obviously another state having a budget very soon. We'll see what they do. Yeah. I don't think I have no insight as to what the Victorian government may do, but I would have thought Melbourne and Sydney obviously are pretty key competitors for business locations, as is Brisbane. So let's see what they do. I think it'll be a good thing, Gabrielle. I think it'll be a good thing.
All right. Okay, changing gears. Sorry.
We saw. I think, Steve, correct me if I'm wrong. Something like 600 odd bits of legislation around. Let's call it the nighttime economy. Live music venues. So now you can have a disco ball in a bar rather than having to be a licensed venue and things like that.
Previously, you could not do that. So
yeah, I know. So just things like that to encourage people to get out and about, spend some money, go and see a live band, and let's support the arts and entertainment industry.
Yeah, which has been hit really hard, as we know. But,
to get at a stroke of a pen to really encourage that type of investment and activity. Yeah, that's just fantastic.
Yeah.
All right. Changing gears. Let's talk about the debt. And is it going to be hard to pay back the debt at the federal and state level? Maybe go to Cherelle, to you on this. Interest rates are very low, so it's almost free, but you got to pay it back at some point. Will interest rates be low for a really long time, do we think? This is a question I think a lot of people are wondering. How much are future generations going to feel the burden of this, or is it not big enough that it'll feel like a burden? Cherelle?
Yeah, it's a good one. It feels horrible, doesn't it? It feels like, how can we take on this much debt right now and know that we can't pay it off for some years? But I think there's a few things that mitigate that as a problem. One is the fact that we know that interest rates will be low for a very long time, and the Reserve Bank has pretty much told us that. And even if they started to creep up, they're certainly not going to creep back up very quickly. And that really is a long, long time away. If, as a consequence of spending this money and lifting debt, we can get economies going again and we can stop entrenched unemployment, then you have a better chance of economies picking up the pace of growth to something close to what it was before, or even perhaps a little bit higher. So if your interest rates are low and your nominal growth rate is higher, over time it sort of eats away at it. And so it's this kind of magic formula where we don't need to worry too much about that, because we know that the economy will to some extent grow its way out of that debt. Now that takes a long time. We don't know that interest rates will be this low forever, but there's certainly more reasons to say that taking on debt and doing your best by the economy right now and stopping people from moving into unemployment for long periods of time is a much better policy than saving your budget for the sake of delivering a balanced or surplus budget. So yes, it's a lot of money, and in fact, T Corp is going to be very busy issuing debt this year and for some years, and you know, it's a big task, but we know, you know, the Reserve Bank is standing right behind them. The Reserve Bank is willing to buy in the secondary market, that's semi-government bonds. So I think all up,
Yeah, won't be that hard to pay it off.
Won't be that hard.
All right, final question for all of you. There's another budget in June, another state budget in June, and I guess a federal budget in May. So right around the corner. What's something you would love to see in the next New South Wales budget? I don't know if you're allowed to answer that, Stephen Walters, but if you
I'm probably not allowed to answer that, Gabrielle, but can I offer a suggestion of that we have a vaccine earlier than we expect? That would be a fantastic outcome. As I think the other speakers said, it's critical to our forecasts is the timing of the borders being reopened, which is dependent on having a vaccine. So if those two vaccine announcements in recent weeks are as good as they sound, I would love to see that in our budget in June, that we've actually got our international borders open. That is not our forecast, but I would love to be able to say that in June.
Yeah. All right, Cherelle and Stephen Halmarick, what would you hope to see in terms of policy or spending decisions in the next New South Wales budget?
So I'd hope that, yes, the emergency phase is over, and so we need less emphasis on those types of policies that just pump money into the economy for the sake of stopping it deflating. But the big one that I'd love to see is just the stamp duty to land tax reform. Let's just get it done.
Yeah, see all the policy detail be worked out so that we're into full implementation by then. Yeah. Okay, Stephen.
Yeah, I was going to say more on tax reform as well. So the stamp duty and the things that we talked about before, payroll tax, GST. So I think, as you mentioned, Gabriel, maybe the new national cabinet can have a real good crack at national tax reform. You know, kind of, if you like, once this kind of emergency part of the COVID response is out of the way, and fingers crossed on a vaccine. So that would be really good to see. You know, the other thing I'd like to see is kind of in the response to the question you just and that Cherelle answered on debt. I'd like to see an end to people saying, wow, there's just too much debt, we're never going to pay it back. I mean, the worst thing we could do, the absolute worst thing we could do, is not support the economy through expanding fiscal policy. And the debt that's being borrowed, an incredibly low cost, is going to return more to the economy than the cost of the debt. I mean, it's kind of simple maths, right? The economic return is going to be higher than the interest cost, then you do it every day. And so I'd like to see people not talking about, you know, the build up of debt, but talking about what are we spending the money on and are we getting the return for that money? That's really the critical question. So let's hope so.
Okay.
Yeah.
I want to thank all three of you for making time and sharing your thoughts today. And I want to thank all of you on the line for being interested in the wonky details of the budget. Yeah, it's a sign of, well, that tells you something about the Committee for Sydney membership, that, yeah, people really understand why this stuff matters.
It's good stuff.
All right. And we can all get back to reading all the detail behind this. Thank you again, and we'll see you at the next one.
Great. Thanks, Gabrielle.
Thank you. Bye-bye.